Sarah sat rigidly in the wooden chair outside the Phoenix Superior Courthouse, her fingertips pressed so hard against the armrests that her knuckles had turned white. Her hands trembled with an involuntary violence that no amount of deep breathing could control. The morning sun beat down relentlessly on the concrete steps, and sweat trickled down her temple, but she felt impossibly cold, as if her body temperature had dropped 20 degrees. Judge would be arriving within the hour, and with that arrival would come the moment that would define the rest of Sarah's life, the moment she either kept her daughter or lost her forever. 3 months. It had only been 3 months since that day. Sometimes it felt like 3 years. Sometimes it felt like 3 hours ago. The events had unfolded so quickly, so catastrophically, that Sarah still struggled to comprehend how her carefully constructed world had collapsed into rubble. She thought back to the life before the allegation, before Child Protective Services, before Michael decided to weaponize her deepest vulnerability, her love for their daughter, Emma. Sarah had been a good mother. She knew this with absolute certainty. She had always been the one who woke up at 3 a.m. for fevers, who researched developmental milestones obsessively, who cut Emma's sandwiches into perfectly bite-sized squares because she'd read that children felt more secure with consistency. She had been the one to leave her high-paying job at the marketing firm because she refused to let someone else raise her daughter during those crucial early years. Michael had never understood that sacrifice. He'd called her obsessive, said she needed to live a little, suggested she was suffocating Emma with her attention. But Sarah knew better. Emma thrived under her care. Emma was happy, healthy, developmentally on track. Her pediatrician said so at every appointment. The divorce had been amicable, at least in the beginning. Michael had agreed to shared custody, seemed genuinely interested in maintaining a relationship with Emma. Sarah had been grateful for that, relieved that despite the dissolution of their marriage, they could co-parent effectively. They'd even made jokes about it, about how they were doing divorce the right way. How naive she'd been. Then came the promotion Michael didn't get, the one that went to his younger colleague. Sarah remembered him coming home furious, drinking too much, saying bitter things about how some people just get lucky and the system is rigged. He'd started making cutting comments about Sarah's career, about how she'd abandoned their marriage by focusing on motherhood, how she'd controlled him through Emma. The comments grew sharper, more vicious. Within weeks, the friendly co-parent had transformed into something harder, colder. That's when the accusations started. At first, they were small things. He mentioned to his lawyer that Sarah seemed overprotective in a way that wasn't healthy. He suggested that perhaps Emma was spending too much time isolated with her mother. He hinted, without evidence, that Sarah had some kind of by-proxy tendency, constantly taking Emma to doctor's appointments that weren't necessary. Sarah had been baffled. She tried to reason with him, to show him Emma's vaccination records, her normal development. But Michael didn't want conversation. He wanted ammunition. Then came the day that haunted every moment of Sarah's existence. She'd been unpacking boxes in the bedroom of their new apartment, a modest, one-bedroom place she'd found after the divorce, in a decent neighborhood with a park nearby where Emma loved to play. They'd just moved in the week before. Everything was chaos, boxes stacked haphazardly, furniture still in wrong places, the smell of cardboard and new paint saturating the air. Emma had been in the living room, contentedly playing with her Fisher-Price toys, the pink elephant and the blue turtle that had been her favorite since she was 18 months old. Sarah could see her daughter from the bedroom doorway, could hear her making up little songs, narrating her play in that precious toddler voice that sometimes made Sarah's heart ache with how quickly Emma was growing. Sarah had been reorganizing their books, lost in thought, planning which titles to donate and which to keep. She wasn't on her phone. She wasn't distracted by television or social media. She was simply a mother in her own home, attending to her daughter's needs while handling the practical necessities of moving. Then the doorbell rang. Michael. She hadn't been expecting him. He wasn't scheduled to pick up Emma until Saturday, and it was only Tuesday. His face was dark with anger when she opened the door, his jaw clenched tight. "I need to get my things," he'd said, pushing past her without greeting. "The lawyer says I can retrieve items I left during the separation. I'm here to collect my belongings." What followed was a conversation that had grown heated far too quickly. Michael made accusations. "You took everything in the divorce. You're trying to alienate Emma from me. You're using her as a weapon." Sarah tried to remain calm, tried to reason with him, but her own frustration had bubbled up. "No, Michael," she'd said, her voice rising. "That's not fair, and you know it. We divided our things fairly. This is about you being angry at your job, not about me or Emma." It was then that Michael's voice had gotten loud, really loud, the kind of volume that filled the small apartment, that carried into the living room where Emma was playing. Sarah remembered feeling her face flush with embarrassment. What would the neighbors think, and also a sharp spike of anxiety about Emma hearing her father angry. "Emma," Michael had shouted, his voice cutting through the apartment like a knife. "Emma, where are you?" Sarah had moved toward him, trying to calm the situation, but he was already walking toward the living room. She'd followed, anxious, trying to de-escalate. She'd put her hand on his arm. "Michael, please, she's upset when you raise your voice like this. Can we just—" But he'd shaken her off, his agitation making his movements jerky, aggressive. He'd stood in the living room doorway, his presence filling the space. Emma had looked up from her toys, confusion and the beginnings of distress on her face. And then, in her anxiety about the situation, in her focus on managing Michael's anger and Emma's reaction, Sarah had made the mistake that would destroy her life. She'd gone back into the bedroom to give them space, thinking that perhaps Michael just needed to see that Emma was fine, that seeing his daughter happy would calm him down. She'd stood in the bedroom doorway, still visible, still present, but not directly hovering over them. Just for a moment. Just to let Michael cool off. It was, she'd later calculated, approximately 90 seconds. In those 90 seconds, Michael had left. Sarah didn't know if Emma had followed him or if he'd asked her to come. She didn't know the exact sequence of events. What she knew was that when she heard the distinctive click of the apartment door closing, the heavy fire safety door that required a key to open from the inside, she'd felt a jolt of alarm. She'd run to the living room to find it empty. Emma was gone. Sarah now sat in that courthouse waiting area 3 months later, and the panic of that moment still lived in her chest like a living thing. She'd run to the apartment complex lobby, screaming Emma's name. She'd found her daughter barefoot in the parking lot, crying, confused, with no understanding of why her daddy had left her or where he'd gone. And that's when everything had fallen apart. The police had come. CPS had gotten involved. Michael had told them a story where Sarah had been negligent, where she'd left Emma unsupervised deliberately, where she was an unfit mother. And because he was calm, collected, and had a lawyer, and because Sarah was terrified and confused and didn't have one, his narrative had taken hold. Now she sat outside this courtroom, waiting for Judge to arrive, knowing that today was the day she would lose her daughter or fight like hell to keep her. She could feel it in her bones. Michael sat inside with his expensive attorney, probably confident, probably already planning how he'd rearrange Emma's room in his house. Sarah's hands shook. Her heart felt like it might shatter into 1,000 pieces. Judge was already late. Judge entered the courtroom at 10:47 a.m., 7 minutes late, though no one dared comment on it. She was a woman in her late 50s, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to see everything. She'd been presiding over family law cases for over 2 decades, and her reputation was formidable. She was fair but unforgiving, compassionate but unflinching when it came to protecting children. As she took her seat and the bailiff called the court to order, Sarah felt her heart begin to hammer against her ribs so violently she wondered if others could hear it. Michael's attorney, Richard, was a shark in a $5,000 suit. He'd won custody battles before, Sarah had done her research obsessively during the 3 months leading up to this trial. He specialized in difficult custody cases, which appeared to be code for cases where he could successfully demonize one parent. His strategy was simple and effective. Establish reasonable doubt about Sarah's fitness as a mother, build a narrative of negligence, and position Michael as the protective parent forced into legal action out of concern for the child. The first witness called was Detective James, no relation to the judge, despite the shared last name. Detective was a man of about 55, with the bearing of someone who had spent 30 years in law enforcement. He had short gray hair, the weathered face of someone who'd seen too much, and the kind of calm authority that came from years of investigating crime scenes and interviewing witnesses. He wore his uniform, not his usual attire, Sarah noted, but clearly chosen deliberately to establish credibility and professionalism. He was sworn in with the kind of solemn gravity typically reserved for murder trials, and Sarah felt her throat close. "Detective," Michael's attorney began, his voice smooth as honey, "can you please tell the court about the circumstances surrounding the discovery of the minor child, Emma, on the afternoon of August 14th? The detective cleared his throat. His voice was measured, professional, devastating in its clinical precision. "Yes, sir. On August 14th at approximately 2:52 p.m., we received a call from a resident of the apartments, located at 2847 Apache Boulevard. The caller reported a child, approximately 3 years old, wandering unattended in the parking lot of the complex. The child appeared distressed, was barefoot, and was unable to provide clear information about her whereabouts or her parents' names." Sarah's hands clenched into fists in her lap. Her lawyer, a competent but not particularly aggressive woman named, had advised her to remain composed. "Don't react," she'd whispered that morning. "Let your composure speak for you." But composure felt like a foreign language to Sarah right now. The attorney leaned forward slightly, his body language designed to draw the judge's attention. "And what did you observe upon arrival at the scene?" The child was seated on a concrete bench near the playground area. She was crying, appeared disoriented, and was unable to articulate how long she'd been outside or where she'd come from. Her feet were bare, indicating she'd left the apartment without proper supervision or care. When we approached her, she couldn't provide her mother's name clearly. She kept saying Mama, but seemed confused about where Mama was. Sarah wanted to scream. Emma was 3 years old. Of course, she couldn't articulate complex information. She was traumatized from following her father outside and being abandoned in a parking lot. But she remained silent, aware of the judge's eyes occasionally flicking toward her. "What happened next?" the attorney prompted. "We called for backup and issued a description of the child to locate her parents. Within minutes, her mother arrived at the scene, frantic and disoriented. She claimed she'd only stepped away for a few moments, but neighbors had reported hearing raised voices from the apartment approximately an hour before the child was discovered outside." An hour. The detective had made it sound like Sarah had left Emma alone for a full hour. Sarah wanted to interrupt to explain, but her attorney placed a warning hand on her knee. The detective continued, his recitation building a narrative so compelling that Sarah could see the judge's expression growing more concerned. "We conducted a welfare check of the apartment. The door had been left unlocked. There was evidence of recent occupancy, toys scattered across the floor, unwashed dishes in the sink, boxes stacked throughout the residence in what appeared to be a state of disorganization. The apartment was also substantially warm. The air conditioning was not operating at appropriate levels, which suggested the child had been without proper environmental controls for an extended period." This wasn't true. Sarah had the AC set to 72 degrees. The apartment was perfectly comfortable, but the detective said it with such conviction, such apparent certainty, that the judge nodded as if this confirmed something. "In your professional assessment, detective, What were your initial impressions regarding the child's safety in that home environment? Here it was, the moment where the detective moved from facts to interpretation, where objective reality bent into subjective judgment. My initial impression was that the child had been left unattended by her mother, the defendant, in a state of neglect. The apartment conditions, combined with the child's inability to locate her mother upon our arrival, and the reports of audible conflict from neighbors, suggested to me that this was not an isolated incident, but rather evidence of a pattern of inadequate supervision and care. Sarah felt her lawyer's hand tighten on her knee. This was devastating. One sentence had transformed a 90-second moment of parental distraction into evidence of a pattern of inadequate supervision. The attorney smiled slightly, the expression of a predator who'd drawn blood. And did you conduct interviews with neighbors? Yes, sir. We spoke with 3 neighbors in adjacent units. 2 of them reported hearing raised voices coming from the apartment earlier in the day. One neighbor stated she heard what sounded like a man's voice raised in anger and subsequent crying. Another stated she thought she heard a child screaming at one point. Emma had been confused, probably crying a little because her father was there and the situation was tense. That wasn't the same as screaming, but the detective presented it as evidence of an unstable environment. And did you observe any evidence of abuse or injury on the minor child? No, sir. However, the absence of physical injury doesn't preclude neglect or inadequate supervision. In my professional experience, children who are regularly left unattended are at high risk for serious injury or worse. In the gallery, Sarah could feel Michael's lawyer's assistants taking notes, capturing every word, every implication. She could see Michael sitting calmly, occasionally glancing back at his family members who sat in the front row of the gallery, his face expressing the appropriate level of concern. In the corner designated as the children's observation area, 4-year-old Emma sat with a court-appointed guardian, oblivious to the testimony that was rewriting her life story. She was coloring with crayons, something about a princess and a castle, her small face peaceful, innocent. She had no idea that the adults in this room were deciding her future, or that her own father had set in motion the events that would tear her away from the only parent who'd ever truly fought for her. The attorney continued his questions methodically, each one designed to build the tower of Sarah's guilt higher and higher. He asked about response times to calls involving child welfare. He asked about statistical likelihoods of injury to unsupervised young children. He asked about Sarah's mental health, her employment history, her stability as a person, questions the detective couldn't directly answer but answered anyway with implications and insinuations. By the time Michael's attorney finally said, "No further questions, Your Honor," Sarah felt as though she'd been physically assaulted. The detective had taken a 90-second moment of distraction, a moment that happened to hundreds of thousands of parents every single day, and transformed it into evidence of criminal negligence. Sarah's attorney had only a few minutes to cross-examine the detective, but the damage was already done. The narrative had been established. The judge had heard the testimony of a professional law enforcement officer, and that testimony painted a picture of a negligent, unstable, unfit mother. As the detective stepped down from the stand, he caught Sarah's eye for just a moment. She didn't see cruelty in his expression or even certainty. What she saw was a man doing his job, recounting facts as he understood them, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, that his interpretation would determine whether a mother got to keep her daughter. Sarah realized in that moment that she wasn't fighting against malice. She was fighting against the inexorable machinery of a system that, once set in motion, had a momentum all its own. And she was losing. Sarah's legs felt like they were made of water as she stood to approach the witness stand. The courtroom seemed to stretch and contract around her, the air suddenly thick and difficult to breathe. Every eye in the room tracked her movement: the judge, the bailiff, the court reporter whose fingers hovered over her keyboard, ready to document every word that came out of Sarah's mouth. Most devastating of all were Michael's eyes, which followed her with an expression that bordered on satisfied anticipation. She placed her hand on the Bible held by the bailiff. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do," Sarah whispered, her voice barely carrying to the back of the courtroom. She sat in the witness chair and discovered immediately that there was no comfortable position. Everything about it felt designed to make a person feel exposed, vulnerable, scrutinized. The chair was slightly elevated, putting her literally above the crowd but also making her feel completely visible. She could see everyone. Everyone could see her. There was nowhere to hide. Her own attorney approached first. At least was sympathetic, her expression warm and encouraging. But even that warmth felt fragile, as if it could shatter at any moment. "Sarah, tell the court about your relationship with your daughter, Emma." Sarah took a breath and began to speak. Her voice came out thin and shaky. Emma is my entire world. I wake up every morning thinking about her. I plan her meals, I research her development, I make sure she has every opportunity to thrive. I left my job so I could be the one raising her, not a worker or a nanny. I wanted to be there for every milestone, every first word, every scraped knee. As she spoke about Emma, Sarah felt the tears beginning to form. She tried to hold them back, remembering instructions to remain composed, but the emotion was too large, too overwhelming. "I've never missed a pediatrician appointment. I've never ignored a fever. I've never," her voice cracked, "I've never intentionally put my daughter in harm's way. Everything I do is for her safety and happiness." Nodded sympathetically. "Now, Sarah, can you walk us through the events of August 14th? What happened that day?" Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and began her account. She described the morning, how normal it had been. She talked about moving into the new apartment, the boxes and the chaos, but also her excitement about giving Emma a fresh start in a safer neighborhood. She described how Emma had been playing contentedly with her toys, the elephant and the turtle, in the living room. "I was in the bedroom unpacking books. It wasn't far. I could see into the living room from where I was. Emma was happy. She was singing to herself, making up little songs the way she does. I wasn't ignoring her. I was just organizing. I was probably in there for maybe 2 minutes, 3 at most." "And then what happened?" prompted gently. "The doorbell rang. It was Michael. I wasn't expecting him. We don't have scheduled visits on Tuesdays. He said he needed to get his things from the apartment, that his lawyer had said he could retrieve items he'd left during the separation. He pushed past me without even saying hello." Sarah paused, remembering the shock of his sudden appearance, the way he'd invaded her space without greeting her or asking to see Emma. "Did he seem upset?" asked. "Yes, very upset. His jaw was clenched. His whole body seemed tense. He started telling me that I'd taken everything in the divorce, that I was trying to keep Emma away from him, that I was using her as a weapon." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she remembered her own frustration. "I tried to tell him that wasn't true, that we divided things fairly, that this seemed to be about his job situation, not about me or Emma. And then—" "Then what?" leaned forward slightly. "Then his voice got very loud, really loud, the kind of volume that filled the whole apartment. I could see Emma's head pop up from the couch. She was looking toward us with confusion. I became very concerned about her being exposed to that kind of conflict." "What happened next?" "Michael walked into the living room. He was asking for Emma, his voice still very loud. I followed him, trying to calm him down. I put my hand on his arm and asked him to please lower his voice, to please not upset Emma. But he shook me off and stood in the living room doorway." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face now, and she didn't bother trying to stop them. This was the moment. This was where the narrative hinged. "I was still right there, Your Honor. I was visible in the doorway of the bedroom. I wasn't abandoning Emma. I was giving them space, trying to diffuse the situation. I stood there for maybe 90 seconds and then I heard the door close, the fire door, and when I came out, Emma was gone. Walked back to her table, and Sarah braced herself for what came next. Michael's attorney, Richard, stood with the kind of slow, deliberate movement designed to psychologically prepare a witness for attack. "Ms., he began, his voice dripping with faux sympathy, "you say you were unpacking books for 2 to 3 minutes. Yes, approximately. Not checking on your daughter. She was in the other room. I could see her. Could you see her the entire time?" Sarah hesitated. The hesitation was fatal. Not every single second, but... So there were moments when you couldn't actually see your daughter. I could hear her. She was singing. I knew she was fine. You knew she was fine, but you couldn't see her. How did you know she was fine? Sarah felt the trap closing around her. Every answer was a mistake. Every clarification made her sound worse. Because she was making noise, she was happy. I was only steps away. Yet she was able to leave the apartment without your knowledge. During the argument with Michael, yes, I was distracted by. So you admit you were distracted, that you were not focused on supervising your child. I was managing a conflict with her father. I was in the apartment. I was. Ms., isn't it true that you chose to go into another room and leave your daughter unsupervised? I didn't leave her. I was right there. I could see the living room from where I was standing. And yet, according to the detective's testimony, your daughter was found wandering barefoot in a parking lot 1 hour later. I don't know how long she was outside. She followed Michael when he left. He didn't tell me he was leaving. He didn't tell me Emma was following him. I only discovered she was gone when I heard the door close. Walked back and forth, his movements calculated to keep the jury's, the judge's attention on him, not on Sarah's answers. Ms., how many times in the 3 months since this incident have you spoken with your daughter about what happened? We haven't talked about it in detail. She's 3 years old. I didn't want to traumatize her further by. You haven't discussed it at all. Not in detail. I've let her process it at her own pace. Or perhaps you've avoided discussing it because you're concerned about what your daughter might say. That's not true. I'm protecting her emotional. By avoiding the truth about your own negligence. Stood objection, argumentative. Judge sustained the objection, but the damage was done. The suggestion hung in the air like poison gas, was painting a picture of a mother more concerned with covering up her own mistakes than with her daughter's trauma. The cross-examination continued for another hour. He asked about her employment history, suggesting that leaving her job indicated instability. He asked about her mental health, implying that anxiety about her daughter's welfare might indicate pathological overprotectiveness. He asked about the divorce, suggesting that her anger at Michael clouded her judgment. With each question, each perfectly crafted trap, Sarah felt herself coming apart. By the time she was finally allowed to step down from the stand, Sarah's hands were shaking so badly she could barely stand. She caught a glimpse of Emma in the observation area, still coloring, still oblivious to the fact that the adults in this room had just spent the afternoon convincing a judge that her mother was a liar and a negligent parent. Sarah sat back down at her table and squeezed her shoulder. "You did well," she whispered. But they both knew the truth. Sarah hadn't done well. She'd been filleted by a man who was far better at this than she would ever be. Michael sat across the room, his expression neutral but satisfied. He knew, as Sarah knew, that the case had just fundamentally shifted. She was no longer fighting to keep her daughter. She was fighting desperately to not lose her entirely. And she was losing that fight. The recess was called at 2:15 p.m. Judge had ordered a 20-minute break, and Sarah felt as though she'd been hit by a truck and left on the side of the road to recover. She went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, someone hollowed out, destroyed, barely holding on. She thought about Emma, about what it would feel like to drive away from this courthouse without her daughter. The image was so catastrophic that she had to grip the sink to steady herself. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Emma sat on a small bench beside the court-appointed guardian. Was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and silver hair, and she'd been nothing but professional and compassionate throughout the proceedings. Emma was coloring with crayons on a piece of white paper, her tiny tongue poking out in concentration as she worked on what appeared to be a princess with an enormous purple gown. Had been watching Emma carefully throughout the day, noting her withdrawn demeanor, the way the child seemed anxious and confused by the proceedings. Emma hadn't spoken much. She'd mostly just colored or played quietly with the toys had brought, but had 30 years of experience working with children in family law cases, and she recognized the signs of a traumatized child trying desperately to process an incomprehensible situation. It was just after 2:20 when the police officers began arriving in the hallway. They'd been in the courthouse for other cases, other testimony. One of them had brought Valor, the police K9 unit's prized Belgian. Valor was a working dog, trained in detection and apprehension, but he had a calm, almost gentle demeanor when he wasn't working. His handler, Officer David Torres, had stopped to chat with another officer in the hallway just around the corner from where Emma was coloring. Noticed the change immediately. Emma's head had lifted from her coloring with sudden, acute attention. Her eyes widened and her entire body seemed to vibrate with a new kind of energy. She wasn't anxious or withdrawn anymore. She was alert, interested, alive in a way hadn't seen all day. "Big doggy," Emma whispered, her voice carrying just enough for to hear. "Big doggy, we're big doggy." Looked up from her documentation and followed Emma's line of sight down the hallway. There, just visible around the corner, was Valor, a massive dog, probably 90 pounds of pure muscle and intelligence. His coat was a rich sable color, and his amber eyes were intelligent and calm. Even from a distance, there was something extraordinary about the dog, something that seemed to reach into Emma's traumatized little brain and touch something that nothing else had reached all day. "Big doggy," Emma said again, more insistently this time. She stood up from the bench, her coloring forgotten. "Can I see Big doggy?" Professional instincts kicked in. She'd seen this before, how animals could reach children in ways that people sometimes couldn't. She stood and took Emma's hand, walking down the hallway toward Officer Torres. The officer saw them approaching and smiled, understanding what was asking without words. "Go ahead," he said. "He's very friendly. Valor loves kids." Emma approached the dog cautiously, her small face tilted upward. Valor's ears perked forward and he lowered his massive head toward the child. For a long moment, there was a connection, something fundamental and unspoken passing between the traumatized 3-year-old and the trained working dog. Valor's tail began to wag. Emma reached out and tentatively touched his fur. "Soft," Emma said softly. "So soft, he nice. Big doggy nice." Watched, taking mental notes. This was the first time all day that Emma had seemed calm, truly calm. The anxiety that had been etched into her small features since they arrived at the courthouse seemed to ease. She continued petting Valor and the dog stood patiently, allowing the child to touch him, to find comfort in his presence. Inside her chambers, Judge was reviewing her notes from the morning's testimony. The detective's account had been damning. Sarah's testimony had been disastrous. Michael's attorney had done an excellent job of painting a picture of maternal negligence. By every conventional measure, this case was trending toward a judgment in Michael's favor. But Judge had been practicing family law for over 2 decades, and she'd learned something that went beyond the conventional measures. She'd learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts were telling her that something wasn't quite right about this case. She stepped out of her chambers and walked through the courthouse hallway during the recess, needing to stretch her legs and clear her head. It was as she was walking that she saw it. Emma, the supposedly traumatized and neglected child, standing beside a massive police dog, petting him with a gentle hand, her face peaceful for the first time all day. And beside Emma stood, watching with an expression that suggested she was observing something significant. Judge paused. She watched for a full minute as Emma interacted with the dog. She noticed how the child's entire demeanor had transformed. She noticed how Valor seemed to understand what Emma needed, simply his calm, patient presence. And then, almost like a hunch, an intuition that had served her well over many years, Judge had an idea. It was unconventional. It was highly irregular. It probably violated several procedural guidelines, but it was also potentially brilliant. When the recess ended and everyone reconvened in the courtroom, Judge called for Emma's testimony to be prepared. But before Michael's attorney could begin his cross-examination, she raised her hand. "I have a procedural matter I'd like to address," she said, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a judge who was not accustomed to being questioned. Mr. Counsel, I've made an observation during the recess break. I'd like to make a request that I believe may help us better understand the child's state of mind." Michael's attorney immediately looked suspicious. "Your Honor, I'd like to request that the police dog currently in the building be brought into the courtroom during Emma's testimony. The child has demonstrated unusual calm in the animal's presence, and I believe it may help facilitate a more accurate account of her experiences." "Your Honor, with all due respect," Michael's attorney jumped to his feet, his face flushing with anger, "this is highly irregular. An animal has no legal bearing on custody proceedings. This could prejudice the court. This could taint the testimony. It's my courtroom," Judge said quietly, and the steel in her voice was unmistakable. "And I have the discretion to allow measures that I believe may help me better understand a child's testimony. I've been practicing law in this court for 22 years, mister. I know what I'm doing." She turned to Officer Torres, who had appeared in the hallway with Valor. "Officer, would you be able to bring the K-9 unit into the courtroom for approximately 15 minutes? Officer Torres nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Valor is well trained and has been in courtrooms before for official purposes. He'll remain calm." "Bring him in, please." What happened next was nothing short of remarkable. As Valor entered the courtroom and took a position near the witness stand, the entire energy of the room seemed to shift. There was a palpable change in the atmosphere. Sarah felt her heart begin to beat with something other than pure despair, not quite hope, but perhaps the faint glimmer of it. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly less confident. Emma was called to take the stand, and instead of the withdrawn, confused child who had been so difficult to understand earlier, something entirely different happened. With Valor's calm presence nearby, Emma seemed to access parts of her memory that had been locked away all day. Her small fingers absently petted the dog's head when she was nervous about a question, and the physical contact seemed to soothe her, to ground her, to help her think more clearly. Judge watched carefully, her expression thoughtful and calculating. She was a judge who understood that law was practiced by human beings, and human beings, especially children, sometimes needed more than procedural propriety to reveal the truth. They needed safety. They needed comfort. They needed witnesses who could help them feel brave enough to speak. As Emma began to testify, noticed what Judge had already perceived. Something fundamental had shifted. The dog had done more than provide comfort. In some inexplicable way, Valor had unlocked something in Emma, a clarity of mind, a sense of security, a willingness to engage with questions and to remember. Sarah sat forward in her seat, her desperation transformed into something that looked almost like hope. For the first time since the trial began, she felt like maybe, just maybe, the truth might have a chance to break through all the carefully constructed lies and implications. Judge's eyes narrowed slightly, watching Emma, watching Valor, watching Michael's increasingly anxious expression. She was about to discover something that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of this entire case. The real trial was about to begin. Emma was placed in a specially designed chair, a smaller chair at a lower height than the witness stand, designed specifically for child testimony. She looked impossibly small in the courtroom, her feet dangling several inches above the ground. The chair had been purchased specifically for cases involving young children, and the court had also installed a cushion and a small footrest to make her more comfortable. Despite these accommodations, Emma appeared nervous, her small hands gripping the armrests tightly. Judge approached the bench and spoke to Emma in a gentle, measured voice. "Emma, my name is Judge. I'm here to listen to you today. I have some questions about what happened to you, but there are no wrong answers. I just want to understand what you remember. Can you do that for me?" Emma nodded, but she didn't speak. Her eyes were wide and uncertain. This was a child who had spent months being questioned, investigated, evaluated. This was a child whose entire world had been upended. The trauma lived in her small body, visible in her rigid posture and her fearful expression. Sat beside Emma, close enough that the child could feel her presence. And nearby, close enough that Emma could reach out and touch him if she needed to, Officer Torres positioned Valor. The dog seemed to understand his purpose. He remained completely still, his amber eyes fixed on Emma with what could only be described as compassion. Judge began gently. "Emma, can you tell me about your home, about where you live with your mommy?" "Mommy home," Emma said softly, her voice barely audible. She reached down and touched Valor's fur, and some of the tension seemed to drain from her body. "Mommy home, nice home, new home." "That's good. And what were you doing the day we found you outside? Do you remember that day?" Emma was quiet for a long moment. This was the difficult part, asking a 3-year-old to recall complex events, to articulate a narrative that most adults would struggle with. But something extraordinary began to happen. As Emma's fingers continued to stroke Valor's soft fur, as she felt the dog's steady, calming presence, her words began to flow. "Boxes," she said. "Mommy boxes, unpack boxes, big boxes, little boxes." "Your mommy was unpacking boxes. Where was your mommy?" "In room, mommy in room." Emma paused and then she added, "I see mommy. Door open, I see." The courtroom was silent. Everyone was leaning forward, listening intently to this child's broken narrative. "You could see your mommy, even though she was in another room." "Yes, see mommy all time." Sarah felt tears beginning to form. Emma was establishing that she hadn't been abandoned, that Sarah had been present, that Sarah could see her. This was important. This was crucial. Judge continued carefully. "Emma, do you remember when your daddy came that day?" Emma's hand stilled on Valor's fur. Her eyes flickered, and for a moment it seemed like she might shut down emotionally. But then she petted the dog again, and the courage returned to her small face. "Daddy come," she said. "Daddy come, door go ding-dong." The doorbell rang. "Yes, ding-dong, daddy there," Daddy loud. Made a subtle gesture. "It's okay, Emma, just tell us what you remember." Daddy loud, "Mommy sad, I hear Daddy say bad words," loud voice, really loud, like. Emma made a booming sound with her small voice, her attempt to convey her father's volume. Like that, but bigger, louder. In the gallery, Sarah felt Michael shift uncomfortably. His attorney leaned over and whispered something to him, his expression growing increasingly tense. "What happened after your daddy came?" Judge asked. "Mommy go to bedroom, daddy in living room, daddy look for me. Say Emma, Emma," really loud voice, "I scared." Sarah wanted to stand up and shout the truth, that she'd followed Michael into the living room, that she'd tried to calm him down, that she'd been right there. But she remained silent, letting Emma tell her story. "Then what happened, Emma?" Emma paused, and for a moment her small body seemed to be processing something complex. Her fingers worked through Valor's fur almost unconsciously, finding comfort in the repetitive motion. "Daddy get things, daddy say I go now. Mommy say please don't go like this. Daddy not listen, daddy go to door." The courtroom seemed to be holding its collective breath. This wasn't a narrative of maternal negligence. This was a narrative of a father leaving. "Did your daddy leave the apartment?" Yes, Daddy go, big door go click. I hear click. Mommy in room, I think. Daddy forget about me. I think Daddy need me. I think Daddy want me to come. Sarah felt her heart physically break. Emma had followed her father because she was afraid he was leaving without her. Because in the mind of a 3-year-old, if Daddy was leaving, she needed to be with Daddy. It was the logic of childhood, the desperate need to stay connected to a parent. So you followed your daddy outside. I follow Daddy. I run, my feet's cold. No shoes, Daddy walk fast. Daddy not look back, Daddy not see me. Michael's attorney stood abruptly. Your Honor, this is highly suggestive. The child is being led. This entire line of questioning is improper and prejudicial. Judge raised her hand, her expression serious but unmoved. Mister, I'm asking open-ended questions. The child is providing her own narrative. I'll allow it. Continue, Emma. Emma looked at Valor again, drew comfort from the dog's presence, and continued. Daddy go to car, I call Daddy, Daddy. But Daddy not here, Daddy get in car, Daddy drive, I cry, nobody there, I scared. I cry and cry and cry. Gently placed her hand on Emma's shoulder. You did such a good job telling us what happened. You were very brave. Judge asked the next question carefully. Emma, did your mommy know you went outside? Emma shook her head vigorously. No, Mommy in room. Mommy not know, Mommy think I play, I follow Daddy fast, very fast, Mommy not see. But your mommy was right there, in the apartment. Yes, Mommy in apartment, in bedroom, Mommy not see me go, but Daddy see me. Daddy go car, Daddy leave me. Sarah realized in that moment that Michael had seen Emma following him and had deliberately chosen not to acknowledge her. He'd gotten in the car and driven away, leaving a 3-year-old in a parking lot. He'd created the entire situation and then let Sarah be blamed for it. Judge leaned back and her expression was grave. She turned to look at Michael, and for the first time, something like contempt flickered across her face. Emma, I'm going to ask you one more question, and then you can sit down. I want you to think very carefully about this. When your daddy left in the car, did your mommy tell you to go outside? No, Emma said definitively. No, Mommy in room. Mommy not tell me, I go because Daddy go. I think Daddy come back, I think Daddy want me. Helped Emma down from the chair, and the child immediately moved toward Valor, burying her face in the dog's fur. Officer Torres knelt beside the child and allowed her to seek the comfort she needed. The courtroom erupted, not in noise but in a kind of shocked silence that was somehow louder than any outbreak of shouting. Sarah felt the room spin. The narrative had inverted completely. The evidence that had been used to condemn her was now evidence of her innocence. Michael's attorney was frantically conferring with his client, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Judge sat back in her chair, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. She looked at Michael with an expression that suggested she was reassessing everything she knew about him. Let the record show, Judge said quietly, that this testimony significantly alters my understanding of the events of August 14th. We will reconvene after a 15-minute recess. As she stood and left the bench, the courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. Sarah looked at Michael and saw him for what he was, a man whose lies had been exposed, whose manipulation had been revealed, whose attempt to weaponize his own daughter had spectacularly backfired. Emma sat on the floor, her small body enveloped by Valor's bulk, seeking and finding the safety and comfort that no human in that courtroom had been able to provide. The truth, finally, had a chance to breathe. The courtroom had been silent for perhaps 30 seconds after Emma stepped down from the witness chair. 30 seconds of absolute, complete silence. The kind of silence that occurs when a fundamental truth has been spoken, when lies have been obliterated, when the carefully constructed narrative of an entire case has been systematically dismantled by a 3-year-old girl and a dog. Emma remained on the floor beside Valor, her small body leaning against the dog's broad chest. Officer Torres had positioned himself so that he was available but not intrusive, understanding that this child had found her anchor and deserved to remain connected to it. Valor's head rested gently against Emma's shoulder, and the two seemed to exist in their own world, separate from the chaos beginning to unfold around them. Judge had called for the 15-minute recess, but she hadn't reconvened yet. The courtroom was still in that liminal space, not officially in session, but not dismissed either. It was in this space that something extraordinary began to happen. Sat down beside Emma on the floor, and as she did, she caught sight of Emma pointing at her father. The gesture was small, almost casual, a child's innocent movement, but its significance was monumental. "That man," Emma said, her voice small but clear in the quietness of the courtroom. "That my daddy." And then, as if to reinforce what she'd already said, as if to make absolutely certain that everyone understood exactly what had happened, Emma repeated the two words that would echo through this courtroom forever. "Daddy, go." She said it again, more insistently, as if the adults around her hadn't fully grasped the fundamental truth of the situation. "Daddy, go." It was so simple, so devastatingly, catastrophically simple. 2 words, the vocabulary of a 3-year-old. And yet those 2 words contained within them the entire truth that dozens of adults with law degrees and decades of experience had failed to uncover. Daddy didn't stay, Daddy didn't protect, Daddy didn't even look back, Daddy went. The words seemed to hang in the air like a physical entity. Sarah felt something break open inside her chest, not in pain this time, but in a sudden, overwhelming rush of validation. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't lying. She wasn't a negligent mother. She had been telling the truth all along, and a 3-year-old had just confirmed it in the simplest possible terms. Michael's face went white. Not pale, not flushed with embarrassment, but completely white, the color of blood draining away, the color of shock and panic and the sudden realization that everything he'd built, every accusation he'd made, every manipulation he'd orchestrated, had just been demolished by his own daughter's innocent words. His attorney stood abruptly, but there was nowhere to go, nothing to say. What could he say? The child had been clear. Michael's entire case, the foundation upon which his attempt to gain custody and destroy Sarah had rested, was now exposed as a lie constructed from whole cloth. Detective, sitting in the gallery where he'd remained after his testimony that morning, felt his stomach twist. He replayed his own investigation in his mind, understanding now what he'd missed. He'd interpreted the evidence through a lens of maternal negligence, but the evidence actually told a different story entirely. Michael's failure to mention his unscheduled visit, his deliberate omission from his statement. The fact that neighbors had heard conflict but hadn't been asked specifically about Michael's presence. The detective realized, with the weight of professional shame, that he'd allowed himself to be guided by the initial assumption rather than by rigorous investigation. Judge reappeared from her chambers. She'd heard the words. Word traveled fast in a courthouse, and a bailiff had informed her of what Emma had said during the recess. As she took her seat on the bench, her expression was grave, angry even. She looked directly at Michael, and there was no mistaking the contempt in her gaze. "The court is back in session," she said formally. Then, turning to the court reporter, she added, "Let the record reflect that the minor child, Emma, upon stepping down from the witness stand, made the statements, 'That man, that my daddy,' and repeated, 'Daddy, go,' twice." She paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle into the official record, making them a permanent part of this case's documentation. Remained beside Emma, and as if on cue, Valor shifted slightly, allowing the child to lean more comfortably against him. The dog seemed to understand that he was serving as an emotional anchor during a moment of tremendous importance. Michael's attorney attempted to stand. "Your Honor, I would like to request a brief continuance. I need to confer with my client regarding these developments." Judge's expression hardened. "I don't think that will be necessary, mister. I believe the facts are now sufficiently clear. However, I do believe that a thorough investigation into the circumstances of August 14th is warranted. Detective, you're still present." The detective stood, looking uncomfortable. "Yes, Your Honor." "Detective, I'm ordering a complete of this case. I want the building security footage from August 14th. I want you to interview neighbors specifically about whether they saw Mr. entering or leaving the building. I want time-stamped evidence of Mr.'s movements that day, and I want that investigation completed within 2 weeks. Understood?" "Yes, Your Honor," the detective responded, his shame now public and undeniable. Judge then turned to Michael's attorney. "Mister, I trust you'll be advising your client to provide complete and accurate information to the detective, as required by law." Michael's attorney's face had gone nearly as white as his client's. "Yes, Your Honor." "Furthermore," Judge continued, her voice sharp as a blade, "this court is ordering a separate investigation into whether Mr.'s actions and statements constitute obstruction of justice, filing a false report to Child Protective Services, and potentially child endangerment. The district attorney's office will be informed of these developments immediately." She paused, looking directly at Michael. "And I am hereby recommending that you consult with a criminal defense attorney separate from your family law counsel, as your interests may no longer be aligned." Michael's head dropped. His attorney leaned over and began whispering urgently to him, but Michael seemed barely to be hearing anything. He was staring at Emma, who was still petting Valor, still seeking comfort from the dog who had inadvertently become the catalyst for the revelation of truth. Sarah felt her legs begin to shake, not from fear now, but from the overwhelming emotional release of knowing that she was going to be vindicated, that the nightmare was ending, that the machinery of justice, however imperfectly, was finally moving toward truth rather than away from it. Judge looked at Sarah, and for the first time since this trial began, there was genuine compassion in her expression. "Ms., I want to express to you that I believe your daughter has been courageous today. What she shared has been difficult but important. I will be giving the matter of custody thorough consideration based on this new information. We will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for closing arguments." She looked at Emma, who was still focused entirely on Valor. "I would also like to commend Officer Torres and the police department for bringing the K-9 unit into this proceeding. In my 22 years on this bench, I have rarely witnessed a more effective means of accessing a traumatized child's truthful testimony." Officer Torres nodded respectfully, his hand resting gently on Valor's head. The dog had done something extraordinary without understanding what he was doing. He'd simply been himself, calm, present, steady. And in being those things, he'd enabled a child to speak truth in a way that no interrogation technique or legal procedure had been able to accomplish. As the courtroom began to empty, Emma continued to sit beside Valor, still stroking his fur. She seemed to understand, on some level too deep for words, that this dog had saved her mother, that his presence had allowed her to be brave enough to tell the truth. Sarah approached her daughter, tears streaming down her face. Judge hadn't reconvened yet, so it wasn't technically improper, though technically nothing mattered anymore. The truth was out. The lies were exposed. "Hi, baby," Sarah whispered, kneeling beside Emma and Valor. "Hi, my sweet girl." Emma looked up at her mother, and for the first time in 3 months, Sarah saw recognition in her daughter's eyes. Recognition and relief, and the beginning of understanding that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. 2 words, "Daddy, go." That's all it had taken. 2 words from a 3-year-old to shatter the entire house of lies that Michael had constructed. 2 words to vindicate Sarah. 2 words to transform the trajectory of an entire family's future. The most powerful words ever spoken in that courtroom had come from the mouth of a child, enabled by the calm presence of a dog, and facilitated by a judge wise enough to trust her instincts. Justice, it turned out, sometimes required more than law. Sometimes it required humanity. Sometimes it required listening to a child. And sometimes it required a dog named Valor. The building manager of apartments called detective at 8:47 a.m. the next morning, before court was even in session. He sounded nervous, apologetic almost. "Detective, I have the security footage you requested. I'm emailing it to you now. I have to say I'm pretty shocked by what's on it. I don't know how I missed this the first time." Detective felt his stomach tighten. He'd spent the entire night wrestling with his conscience, reviewing his initial investigation, understanding how thoroughly he'd allowed himself to be guided by incorrect assumptions. Now, as he received the video files and began to review them, the truth emerged with absolute, irrefutable clarity. 1:15 p.m. Michael entered the building through the front entrance. He was walking quickly, his jaw clenched, his body language aggressive. He was clearly agitated. 1:23 p.m. Security camera footage from the hallway outside Sarah's apartment door showed Michael pressing the doorbell. Sarah answered. They spoke for approximately 2 minutes in the doorway, their conversation animated, clearly contentious. 1:28 p.m. Michael entered the apartment. The hallway camera showed the door closing behind him. 1:47 p.m. Michael exited the apartment. This was the key moment. This was the moment that proved everything. As Michael walked toward the elevator, Emma could be seen in the hallway behind him, small, barefoot, confused, reaching toward her father. Michael heard her crying. He turned, looked directly at his daughter, and then deliberately turned away. He pressed the elevator button and stepped inside as Emma reached the hallway. 1:48 p.m. Emma stood alone in the hallway, crying, looking desperately toward the closed elevator doors. 2:47 p.m. Neighbors found Emma in the parking lot. The timeline was devastating. It was irrefutable. It was criminal. Detective immediately printed the footage and drove to the district attorney's office. He didn't wait for appointment scheduling or bureaucratic procedure. He walked directly to the office of Assistant District Attorney Reeves, a prosecutor known for her aggressive stance on crimes involving children. "We have a problem," said without preamble, "and I'm partly responsible for it. I conducted an incomplete investigation 3 months ago. Based on that incomplete investigation, a mother has been wrongfully accused of child neglect, when in fact the father orchestrated the entire situation and deliberately abandoned his daughter in a public parking lot." Ada Reeves watched the security footage. Her expression grew darker with each passing second. "This is obstruction of justice," she said quietly. "Filing a false report to CPS, child endangerment, possibly even child abandonment. Do you have his statement from the initial investigation?" "Yes. He claims he only contacted Sarah once, through his lawyer, about retrieving personal items. He specifically states in his written account that he was never at the apartment on August 14th. He claims his attorney was supposed to coordinate pickup and that Sarah deliberately prevented it." Reeves's eyes flashed with anger. "That's the opposite of what happened. This man didn't just abandon his daughter. He lied to police. He lied to Child Protective Services. He filed a false report that resulted in wrongful investigations into the mother. This is deliberate, calculated deception in service of gaining custody. We need to move fast. We need to bring him in for a formal interview." By 10:15 a.m., Michael was sitting in an interrogation room with his family law attorney, Richard. His face had transformed overnight. The confidence, the swagger, the predatory confidence, all of it had evaporated. He looked like a man who just realized his client had lied to him, and lied spectacularly. Ada Reeves played the security footage without commentary. She let the video speak for itself. She watched Michael's face as he watched himself deliberately walking past his crying daughter without acknowledging her. She saw the moment when he understood that the game was over. "Mr. Reeves said quietly, you have the right to remain silent. I strongly recommend you exercise that right. However, I am going to inform you that you are under investigation for obstruction of justice, filing a false report to Child Protective Services, child endangerment, and potentially child abandonment. The evidence against you is substantial and includes timestamp security footage that directly contradicts your statements to law enforcement. Michael looked at his attorney, looked devastated, betrayed, furious. I need to speak with my client privately, said, his voice tight. 20 minutes later, emerged from the interrogation room and walked directly to Ada Reeves's office. He looked diminished, defeated. My client wishes to cooperate, said. He is prepared to withdraw his custody claim and accept supervised visitation pending the outcome of any criminal proceedings. He is also prepared to issue a statement acknowledging that he made false reports to Child Protective Services. I would like to discuss potential plea arrangements. Reeves didn't smile. Your client deliberately abandoned a 3-year-old child, a child who was found barefoot and traumatized in a parking lot. He then lied to police and filed false reports that caused a mother to be wrongfully investigated for child neglect. The only reason I might consider a plea arrangement is because that arrangement would need to include jail time and a substantial amount of restitution to Ms. Sarah for the emotional and financial harm caused by his actions. She paused, her expression cold and professional. He can also expect to lose custody of his daughter entirely, not shared custody, not visitation. Supervised visitation only if that, pending the outcome of the criminal case. Back in the courthouse, Sarah sat in a small conference room with her attorney. Word had reached them about Michael's interrogation, about the security footage, about the criminal charges being filed. Looked at Sarah with an expression of vindication. We won, said simply. Not just the custody case. He's going to be prosecuted. The lies, the false reports, the abandonment, it's all documented. The security footage is clear. Emma's testimony corroborated the footage. You've been completely exonerated and he's facing criminal charges. Sarah felt something inside her crack open, something that had been sealed shut since August 14th. The tension that had lived in her chest, the constant fear, the desperate uncertainty, it all seemed to drain away at once, leaving her simultaneously lighter and more devastated by the realization of how close she'd come to losing her daughter. What happens now? She asked. Now we go back to court. Judge is going to issue her custody ruling. Given the evidence, you're going to get full, unconditional custody. Michael is going to be ordered to pay child support and likely restitution, and then he's going to face criminal charges. In another office, Detective sat with his supervisor, Lieutenant. They were reviewing the original investigation file, comparing it to the security footage, examining where assumptions had been made instead of facts being. I failed this case, said quietly. I allowed myself to be guided by the initial narrative instead of conducting a thorough investigation. A mother was wrongfully accused because of my incomplete work. Lieutenant nodded slowly. Yes, you did fail this case, but you're also the one who reopened it when new evidence was presented. You're the one who provided the thorough investigation the second time around. You corrected your mistake. That's the measure of a good detective, not making no mistakes, but being willing to correct them when they're made. It wasn't absolution, but it was something. Understood that he would carry the weight of this case for the rest of his career. It would make him a better investigator, more careful, more thorough. But it would also remind him of the consequences of taking shortcuts. The news had spread through the courthouse like wildfire. Michael's withdrawal of his custody claim, the criminal investigation, the security footage evidence. Judge's office had the media, understanding that a story this significant, a father who'd orchestrated false accusations against his ex-wife and abandoned his own daughter, was a matter of public interest. Sarah walked through the courthouse hallways and people were watching her differently now. No longer with suspicion or judgment, but with sympathy and recognition of what she'd endured. In the courtroom, Michael sat with his new criminal defense attorney, looking smaller somehow. Diminished. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the stunned expression of a man watching his life collapse in real time. Judge took her seat, and the courtroom came to order. Based on the security footage evidence, the testimony of the minor child, and the subsequent investigation, this court is making the following ruling, she began, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. All accusations against Ms. Sarah are hereby dismissed. Custody of the minor child, Emma, is granted to Ms. on a permanent basis. Mr. Michael is ordered to pay child support in the amount of $1,200 per month. He is ordered to pay restitution to Ms. Sarah in the amount of $25,000 for legal fees, emotional distress, and investigation costs. Visitation for Mr. is suspended pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. She paused, looking directly at Michael. Furthermore, this court is referring this matter to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. The evidence suggests deliberate, calculated deception designed to weaponize a child against her mother. This behavior represents a serious breach of parental responsibility and potentially violates multiple statutes. Sarah felt her knees buckle with relief. It was over. The nightmare was over. She had her daughter. Justice had been done. Truth had prevailed. And it had taken a dog named Valor to make it possible. The final judgment was delivered on a Thursday morning in late September, exactly 6 weeks after the day Emma had been found in the parking lot. 6 weeks that had felt like 6 years. 6 weeks of uncertainty, fear, legal battles, and the slow, painful process of truth emerging from beneath layers of deception. Judge's words were spare and official, but their meaning was absolute. Full and unconditional custody of the minor child, Emma, is hereby awarded to her mother, Sarah. All allegations of child neglect are dismissed. All investigations into Ms. Sarah are concluded. This case is closed. She looked directly at Sarah. Ms., I want to say on the record that I believe you have demonstrated exceptional strength and resilience throughout this process. Your devotion to your daughter is evident, and I have no doubt that she will continue to thrive in your care. Then she looked at Michael, who sat beside his criminal defense attorney, his face hollow and defeated. Mister, the criminal proceedings will be handled separately. However, I want to be clear that this court finds your actions to have been deliberate, calculated, and designed to harm not only your ex-wife but your own daughter. The consequences you now face are the direct result of your own choices. Sarah felt squeeze her hand beneath the table. The attorney leaned over and whispered, "It's over. You won. You have your daughter." The courtroom seemed to shimmer around Sarah as if reality itself was having trouble adjusting to this new narrative. She'd spent so many months preparing for the worst, bracing for the moment when Emma would be taken away. Now, sitting in this courtroom with a judge having declared her not guilty of any wrongdoing, having declared her a fit and loving mother, it felt surreal. Emma was waiting in the observation room with, who had been a constant presence throughout this ordeal. When Sarah entered, Emma looked up from the coloring she'd been doing, and her small face broke into a smile, a genuine, joyful smile that had been absent for far too long. "Mommy," Emma ran toward her small legs pumping as fast as they could carry her. Sarah knelt and caught her daughter, lifting her into her arms and holding her so tightly she worried she might be holding too hard. But Emma didn't complain. She wrapped her small arms around Sarah's neck and held on like she was afraid her mother might disappear. "I got you, baby," Sarah whispered into Emma's hair. "I've got you and I'm never letting you go. We're going home, just you and me. We're going home." Smiled with tears in her eyes. "You did it," she said to Sarah. "You fought for her and you won." Outside the courthouse, the morning sun was brilliant and warm. Sarah walked down the steps slowly, not wanting the moment to end, wanting to imprint this feeling, this lightness, this freedom, into her permanent memory. Emma held her hand and Sarah carried her small suitcase with their things. But as they reached the bottom of the steps, Officer Torres appeared with valor. The police dog was off duty now, walking peacefully on a regular leash, not the tactical gear he wore when he was working. But seeing him, Emma's entire body seemed to vibrate with recognition and joy. "Big doggy," she cried, pulling Sarah toward the dog. "Big doggy, big doggy." Officer Torres smiled and knelt, allowing Emma to run into Valor's embrace. The dog, with an intelligence and gentleness that seemed to transcend species, lowered his massive head and allowed the small child to wrap her arms around his neck. "He wanted to be here," Officer Torres said to Sarah. "Valor and we wanted to see how things ended. When we heard the ruling, I thought maybe Emma would want to say goodbye properly." Sarah found herself crying, not tears of pain or fear, but tears of overwhelming gratitude. She knelt beside her daughter and Valor, and for a moment the three of them existed in a small circle of healing and connection. "Thank you," Sarah said to Officer Torres. "I don't have words for what this dog did for us. He gave Emma the courage to speak the truth. He gave me back my daughter." "He did what dogs do," Torres said simply. "He showed up and loved without judgment. He provided safety. He made it possible for a traumatized child to feel brave enough to speak. That's the gift animals have. They ask nothing and give everything." Emma was still holding Valor, her face buried in his fur. The dog stood patiently, his tail wagging slowly, as if he understood that this moment mattered, as if he knew that he'd been part of something important. Over the next hour, Sarah and Emma sat on a bench near the courthouse plaza, and Emma petted Valor while Officer Torres sat nearby. They didn't talk much. There wasn't really anything that needed to be said. The words had all been spoken in that courtroom. Now was the time for quiet, for presence, for allowing the magnitude of what had happened to settle into their bones. Finally, Officer Torres stood. "I should get him home. But Emma, I want you to know something. Valor is a hero. Do you know what that means?" Emma shook her head. "It means he's someone who helps people when they need help. You were very brave in court, and Valor was brave too. You two were a team. You helped each other be brave." Emma nodded solemnly, understanding in the way that children sometimes do, that this had been important, that it had mattered. As they watched Officer Torres and Valor walk away, Emma turned to Sarah. "Valor saved us, Mommy." Sarah felt fresh tears forming. "Yes, baby, Valor saved us." The drive home was quiet. Emma fell asleep in her car seat before they'd even left the courthouse parking lot, her small hand still holding the toy dog that had given her during the trial. Sarah drove carefully, aware that she had her most precious possession with her, aware that this moment, returning home with full custody, with vindication, with truth on her side, was a moment she'd almost lost forever. She thought about all the women who didn't have Judge, women who didn't have Officer Torres and Valor, women whose truth didn't emerge, women who lost their children because the system failed them. She thought about Michael, sitting with his criminal defense attorney, facing years of prison time. She thought about how easily his lies could have worked, how close she'd come to disaster. But mostly, she thought about Emma, about her daughter's courage, about how a 3-year-old girl had spoken truth with a clarity and simplicity that had penetrated all the layers of legal complexity and adult manipulation, about how sometimes the most powerful voices are the smallest ones, but only if we're willing to listen. When they arrived home, Sarah carried Emma inside and laid her on the couch, covering her gently with a blanket. She stood for a long moment, just watching her daughter sleep. The child's face was peaceful now, the stress and anxiety that had lived there for months finally beginning to ease. Sarah made tea and sat by the window looking out at the neighborhood. She thought about all the small moments she'd almost missed, the bedtime stories, the morning cuddles, the silly songs Emma made up, the ordinary, extraordinary moments that comprised a life together. She'd almost lost all of it. Her phone rang. It was. "I wanted to check in," her attorney said. "How are you doing?" "I don't think I've fully processed it yet," Sarah admitted. I keep thinking it's going to be taken away, like I'm going to wake up and this will have been a dream. It's not a dream, it's real. You have your daughter. Michael is facing criminal prosecution. You've been completely exonerated. And more importantly, you have the validation that comes from the truth being revealed. That matters. That changes something fundamental. After they hung up, Sarah sat in the quiet of her apartment and allowed herself to feel the magnitude of what had happened. She'd survived something that could have destroyed her. She kept fighting when everything seemed lost. And her daughter had spoken truth at exactly the moment when it mattered most. Emma woke as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. She padded into the kitchen in her bare feet, her hair sleep-mussed, and looked up at her mother. "Mommy, I hungry." Sarah laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from deep in her belly and felt like the first genuine laugh she'd laughed in months. "Let's make something special. What do you want?" "Mac and cheese, with the little pieces of cheese and the ones you cut up, and maybe goldfish crackers on top." "That sounds perfect, baby." As Sarah cooked and Emma sat at the table, drawing pictures of valor and repeating big doggy, Sarah felt something settle in her chest. Peace. Not the absence of pain or trauma, those would take time to fully process, but the peace that comes from knowing that you fought with everything you had, that truth prevailed, that justice, however imperfectly, was served. That night after Emma was asleep, Sarah sent a text message to Officer Torres. "Thank you for today. Thank you for everything. Thank you for valor." His response came back within minutes. "Valor says you're welcome. He says Emma was very brave. He says you both were. You take care of that little girl." Sarah set the phone down and looked at Emma sleeping peacefully in her bed, her small hand still clutching the toy dog. Tomorrow, life would begin again. Tomorrow, they would start the process of healing, of moving forward, of building a new life together. One that was rooted in truth and protected by the knowledge that justice ultimately had been done. But tonight, Sarah simply sat beside her daughter and allowed herself to breathe, allowed herself to feel the weight lifting, allowed herself to believe that the nightmare was truly over. Her family was whole, her daughter was safe, and somewhere out there, a Belgian named Valor was sleeping peacefully, unaware that he had fundamentally changed the trajectory of two lives with nothing more than his presence, his calm, and his infinite capacity for unconditional love. The story of Sarah and Emma had begun in devastation and deception, but it had ended in truth, in justice, in the power of love, and the unexpected heroism of a dog who simply showed up when he was needed most. And that, Sarah thought as she finally turned off the light, was the most beautiful ending she could have imagined.